Hello everyone, welcome to GS Booster Short, your daily dose for GS preparations. In our today's lecture, we're going to talk about a new geopolitical development in respect of a plurilateral engagement between four important countries, which includes India, USA, Israel and United Arab Emirates. It has been also touted as the new Quad. This topic is important with respect to GS2 topics such as groupings and agreements involving India and or affecting India's interest. Basically, after Indo-Pacific, it is India's way out to Indo-Arab. Now, why has this been in news? So recently, foreign ministers of India, US, Israel and UAE had a virtual meeting in which they realized that these countries can engage on and do more when they are together. Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar pointed out that like in Quad, the significant vaccine initiative which was taken by these four countries, that would not have been possible had they been doing bilateral engagements. And therefore, in order to exploit the synergies that could be created between these four countries and in the region itself, it is very important for these four groupings to come together and work together. So therefore, a new notion of this new Quad is being developing. Now, this also shows a shift in India's foreign policy. Now, let us first see as to what are the factors which has made this alignment possible. Number one and chief is the Abraham Accords. So, during the presidency of Donald Trump, Abraham Accords refers to basically a number of agreements between certain Arab countries and Israel. These countries and Israel were not seeing an eye to eye with one another. However, now they have recognized Israel as a sovereign country. Now, which are these countries? These are UAE, Jordan, Sudan and others. So, now this has made possible the cooperation between Arab countries and Israel. Both these parties need one another. Israel needs them for their own security and sustaining its position in the very region. Whereas the Arab countries, which has now been already reliant a lot on energy, are seeking to new ways out. Israel provides them the technology to achieve that very thing. Then, the second issue is with respect to Turkey's enhanced assertion in this very region. Now, these days, Turkey is playing out an assertive card and is actually trying to lead the Islamic world. Now, this has created rupture in the West Asian system, and therefore there is an enhanced need towards tackling Turkey's enhanced assertion in this very area as well. Then it is the US pivot to Asia. US has already been in the past few decades been a lot engaged in the Middle East. Now US is trying to shift its sight to Indo-Pacific, and for that there is a vacuum being developing in the West Asia, and this is going to impact the West Asian politics as well. However, US does not want to leave this vacuum, and therefore it needs more partners. With respect to India, if we see now, India, in my previous lectures, I have articulated with you one important fact, that for us to tackle China's assertion, and for that matter even for US to tackle China's assertion, with the amount of money that China is today flowing and pumping into the world, into various countries, it is very difficult for one party to tackle China alone. Therefore, a plurilateral approach, a multilateral approach has to happen in order to tackle China. And therefore, in this very manner, these are the reasons which are responsible for these four countries to actually see the synergies that could be created by them coming together. Now, what are the significance of this very move with respect to India's foreign policy? Number one, it shows a shift towards a regional approach. Till now, India was developing one-on-one relations with all the Arab countries, and now India is trying to now transform these relations into a regional approach. Therefore, it actually shows that we are seeing an enhanced role for ourselves in West Asian politics as well, and not just in Indo-politics. And this is the manner in which we are actually expanding our influence into the world. If India today envisions to be at the forefront, at the global high table, and envisioning new roles towards world leadership, India has to have such a regional approach. Then, we have seen of late that there is definitely a shift towards West in Indian foreign policy, be it with respect to Indo-Pacific also. So therefore, we see that US, which is actually has been the main player in West Asian politics, has roped in India in this very area for basically maintaining stability and preventing this area, the countries in this very area, to go into the Chinese trap or under China's influence. Then, lastly, it is very important to tackle Pakistan. Of late, Pakistan has been developing relations with Turkey and Iran, and therefore Pakistan is trying to create a new basically phenomena or new theory with respect to Islamic nations coming together, and therefore it is important to tackle Pakistan also. Now, let us see. Lastly, we have deepening relations. We have deepened our relations with all these three partners. With respect to US, we can already see that we have entered into numerous four agreements, framework agreements such as the CAATSA, and our enhanced cooperation with US is manifested towards our joint approach towards Indo-Pacific and our partnership with them in the Quad. Then, with Israel, Israel has come up as our largest, one of the top defense suppliers to India. With respect to UAE, UAE is extremely vital for our energy security. UAE also happens to be the third largest trading partner of India. And in West Asia, UAE happens to be the first largest trading partner to India. Now, what would be the way forward? Now, way forward, we have to see that it will be too early to actually put a framework to this very grouping. This grouping has already said that in their very organization, they said this thing and made it very clear that there is not a military angle to this very grouping. This grouping is actually going to enhance cooperation towards a better development, better creating peaceful society, and taking stands on issues of international importance. With respect to India, we have to see that we do not get embroiled in the regional rivalries. Over here, I am pointing towards Iran, with which Israel and UAE both have an uncomfortable relations. However, India has made it already clear that India is having good relations with Iran, and therefore this grouping has nothing to do with Iran. On the same hand, UAE and Israel also have significant economic interests in China, and therefore they are also trying to actually make this grouping so that they do not put all their eggs in the one basket. And therefore, with respect to UAE, what we have to see, like, we cannot just see from our side, our lens. We have to also see from the lens of the other two members, which is the UAE and Israel. UAE is actually concerned. Why? Because China has entered into a 25-year-long agreement with Iran, and therefore by actually entering into such an agreement and such an association with the countries who are actually this Western bloc of which India is today a part, which are actually anti-China, this is in this very manner UAE is also trying to send a signal to China, and in this very manner trying to create the regional balance. With respect to Israel, now China is developing a number of ports in Israel, and Israel also wants to be sure that his entire trade is not dependent on Chinese influence, and therefore with the money that could be supplied by the Arab nation, that is the United Arab Emirates, with the manpower and skill of India, with the global influence of US, it can actually, and with the technology of Israel itself, infrastructure can be created parallel to the infrastructure that China has been creating, and in this very manner China could be balanced in the region. Now, the four things that these countries bring to the table is naturally, with respect to UAE, it's the money. With respect to Israel, it's the technology. With respect to India, it's the manufacturing and the manpower and human resources. With respect to USA, it is the global influence and the tap that US has on international economic lines. However, what that we have to see, India has to see, is that it just do not let this group embroiled into regional politics and to use this group for developmental purposes, and then somehow using this group as a counter to develop to actually balance out Chinese influence. Also, this group would be helpful to us in checking the Chinese influence, which is going to enhance this very region with the coming up of the Gwadar port as well. India has on this very hand also entered into an agreement with Oman recently. Basically, we had a shared military agreement and with respect to maritime security agreement with Oman earlier. We have recently renewed that agreement. What happens with this thing is that we get basically information about the ships which have been coming through that very route, because Oman has a tap over that very region. And this is helpful for us into checking out the activities that China would be taking up in this very region through its Gwadar and other installations. So, this is all with respect to this lecture. Should you have any doubts, feel free to put your doubts in the comment section. I'd be more than happy to reply to them. Thank you and have a nice day.